The story begins on the edge of a vast and untamed land. Imagine the year is the early 1600s. The Atlantic Ocean stretches endlessly behind us, carrying with it the echoes of the old world. For those first settlers, the journey had been long. Many came cramped aboard wooden ships, rocked for weeks by the restless waves. At night, they dreamed of what they would find: fertile soil, open spaces, freedom to live and worship as they wished. But dreams have a way of mixing with fear, and there was plenty to fear. When they first stepped onto these shores, they were met with a silence so deep it seemed almost alive. The forests loomed, thick and ancient, whispering in the wind. Rivers, wide and strong, wound their way toward the sea. The air smelled different, fresh and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. It must have felt both thrilling and overwhelming, like standing on the edge of a story yet to be told. In those early days, life was a mixture of discovery and survival. The seasons ruled everything. Spring brought a burst of green and the chance to plant crops. Summer meant long, hot days of work under the sun. Autumn was a time of gathering. Harvests brought both relief and worry, for the winter ahead could be harsh. And winter was a test of endurance. The settlers' homes were humble, built from whatever materials were at hand: logs, rough boards, stones gathered from nearby fields. Inside, they were warm but simple: a hearth for cooking and heat, rough tables and benches, beds stuffed with straw. These were not places of luxury, but of necessity, and yet there was comfort in their plainness. The fire's glow at night, the smell of bread baking, the murmur of quiet conversation, these things stitched life together. Food was precious. In the beginning, many relied on what they could find or trade with the native peoples: corn, beans, squash, fish, and game. Over time, settlers learned to grow their own crops and raise animals. But hunger was never far from memory. A poor harvest or an early frost could mean long months of scarcity. The native peoples were not strangers in this land. They had been here for countless generations, knowing its seasons, its trails, its gifts. Encounters between them and the settlers were sometimes peaceful, built on trade and mutual need. At other times, they were tense or even violent. Two worlds had met, and the space between them was not always easy to bridge. When night fell, the wilderness became a world of its own. The stars burned brightly overhead, far more than most settlers had ever seen in the crowded cities of Europe. Owls called in the darkness. Wolves howled from deep in the forest. And inside those small cabins, families huddled together, listening, their minds wandering to both the dangers and wonders beyond their doors. If you pause here and close your eyes, you might imagine the feeling of sitting beside a fire in that time, hearing the crackle of the wood, tasting the warmth of stew after a cold day, and knowing that, for all the hardships, this was the beginning of something new. As the first months turned into years, the settlers began to learn the patterns of this new land. The wilderness began to feel a little less like an enemy and more like a cautious friend, still unpredictable, still wild, but slowly familiar. Neighbors became lifelines that a single family could not survive alone for long, not in those days. If a roof caved in during a storm, others would come to help repair it. If a hunter returned with more meat than his family could eat, he would share it with those in need. In the colonies, survival was not just a matter of skill, it was a matter of community. But community did not mean a lack of challenges. Illness could sweep through a settlement with little warning. Without doctors nearby, only a handful of trained healers scattered across great distances, families relied on herbal remedies, folk knowledge, and prayer. Some illnesses passed quickly, but others left deep grief in their wake. Roads were little more than dirt paths, and in bad weather, they turned to thick mud. Rivers could be crossed only at certain points, and bridges were rare. Those who ventured far from home often carried both provisions and weapons, knowing that the journey might take longer than expected. Still, there were moments of beauty and rest. In the spring, fields shimmered with wildflowers, violets, daisies, and golden buttercups swaying in the breeze. In the fall, the forests blazed with color, their leaves turning shades of crimson, amber, and gold. Even the snow of winter, though cold and unyielding, brought a quiet peace to the land, muffling the noise of the world and making each cabin a warm refuge. Religion played a deep role in colonial life. For many settlers, their journey across the ocean had been driven by a desire for freedom to worship in their own way. Churches were often among the first buildings constructed, and Sunday was a sacred day. Evenings were gentle times when the day's labor was done. Parents might tell stories of the old country or of adventures in the wilderness. Children listened wide-eyed, their imaginations carrying them far beyond the cabin walls. It is easy, from where we stand now, to see only the hardship. But if we listen closely, we can also hear the heartbeat of hope that carried them through. Every seed planted was a promise to the future. Every home built was a declaration that they belonged here. If you were to step outside one of those cabins on a quiet autumn night, you might smell wood smoke drifting from chimneys, hear the faint sound of laughter from a neighbor's home, and see the stars spilling their light over a land still untamed but slowly becoming home. By the time the colonies had taken firmer root, life had settled into a rhythm. The days followed the pull of the seasons, and though each season had its challenges, each also carried its own quiet blessings. Spring began with the thaw. Snow melted into rushing streams, and the ground softened underfoot. This was a busy time. Fields had to be cleared, seeds planted, fences mended. The work was constant, but there was a sense of renewal in it. Each seed dropped into the earth was a whisper of hope, a silent prayer that the months ahead would be kind. Summer brought long days of labor. The sun rose early, spilling golden light over the fields and forests. Farmers tended their crops from morning until dusk, pausing only briefly to drink cool water from a well or stream. In towns, blacksmiths hammered at their forges, bakers pulled fragrant loaves from their ovens, and merchants kept their shops open to travelers and neighbors alike. The air was filled with the scent of ripening fruit, fresh-cut hay, and, on especially hot days, the sharp tang of rain before a storm. Autumn was the season of gathering. Families worked together to bring in the harvest: corn, wheat, pumpkins, apples. These were stored carefully in cellars and granaries, ready to see them through the winter. The evenings grew cooler, and the trees turned to fire and gold, as though the land itself was celebrating a year's hard work. Harvest time often brought small gatherings and celebrations, simple meals shared among neighbors, with laughter carrying into the crisp night air. Winter was the season of stillness. Snow blanketed the land, muffling every sound except the wind's low sigh through bare branches. Evenings were quiet, often spent in storytelling, singing, or simply watching the fire burn low. These seasons shaped the settlers not just in body, but in spirit. They taught patience, endurance, and gratitude for small blessings: a warm loaf of bread, a well-mended roof, a neighbor's helping hand. Life here was not built on comfort, but on resilience. And yet, there was a beauty in that. If you were to stand on a hill overlooking a colonial town in the late afternoon, you might see thin trails of smoke rising from chimneys, hear the rhythmic ring of a blacksmith's hammer, and catch the laughter of children drifting on the breeze. You would see a place both fragile and strong, still growing, still learning to call this new world home. And in the hearts of those who lived here, there was a quiet understanding. Each day survived was not just another page in their lives. It was part of the larger story of a people learning to belong in a vast, untamed land. In the early colonies, the heart of life often beat within the small towns and villages. These were places where everyone knew one another, where news traveled quickly, and a helping hand was never far away. The town center was usually simple, perhaps a meeting house that doubled as both church and gathering hall, a few shops selling necessities, and a green or common field where livestock might graze. On market days, farmers and tradesmen would set up stalls or open their doors, filling the air with the mingled scents of fresh bread, leather, and wood shavings. Taverns were more than places for a drink. They were the social heart of many towns. For many settlers, life was centered around family. Homes were small by modern standards, often a single room serving as kitchen, dining space, and sleeping quarters. Yet within those walls, bonds were strong. Parents taught their children the skills they would need to survive: how to plant a field, mend a torn garment, split wood for the fire, or prepare food for winter storage. Children learned quickly, because in the colonies, every pair of hands mattered. Farmers' fields stretched toward the horizon, bordered by stone walls or split rail fences. A visit from a neighbor might mean traveling by horse or on foot for miles, yet those visits were treasured. They brought not only conversation but news, tools borrowed and returned, seeds exchanged, and sometimes even a helping hand during planting or harvest. Religion, too, was woven into the rhythm of life. On Sundays, families walked or rode to the meeting house, often dressed in their best, plain but neat. The service could last for hours, and afterward, there was time to greet friends and share a meal before returning to the week's work. The colonies were a place where differences were slowly beginning to blend. In some towns, you might hear English spoken on one street, Dutch on another, and German in the fields beyond. Over time, these traditions began to mingle, giving the colonies a character all their own. In the evenings, the world slowed. Life was far from easy, but in those quiet hours, it was rich in its own way, rooted in community, shaped by the land, and carried forward by the steady rhythm of work and rest. If you stood in one of those small towns at night, you would see stars scattered thick across the sky, and perhaps you would feel a sense of peace, a reminder that even in the hardest of times, there can be warmth, connection, and the simple beauty of belonging. Beyond the safety of towns and villages, the wilderness stretched endlessly. Dense forests, rolling hills, wide rivers, and vast open plains made up most of the landscape. But they could also feel intimidating, shadows shifting between the trees, the call of unseen animals echoing in the night. Paths were few and often overgrown, and travelers could lose their way without careful attention. Those who ventured deep into the woods carried an axe, a knife, and often a musket, not only for hunting but for protection. The rivers were lifelines. They carried canoes and small boats laden with furs, grain, and goods for trade. They offered fresh water for drinking and irrigation. In summer, they were a source of cool relief. In winter, they froze over, becoming silent highways of ice. But rivers could also turn fierce. Heavy rains swelled them into roaring torrents, sweeping away anything in their path. For those who lived closer to the frontier, life was even more demanding. Clearing land for farming meant cutting down trees, pulling up roots, and breaking the stubborn soil. It was exhausting work, done by hand and often under a hot sun. The rewards came slowly. Sometimes years passed before a farm truly yielded enough to feed a family well. Yet, amid the challenges, there was beauty that could take one's breath away. The call of a loon over a still lake at dawn. The first blush of pink on the horizon after a long, cold night. The scent of wildflowers drifting on a warm breeze. Relationships with native peoples varied greatly. In some regions, there was mutual trade, corn and furs in exchange for tools, cloth, and other goods. Native guides often showed settlers the best hunting grounds or taught them which plants could heal and which could harm. In other places, mistrust and conflict grew, sometimes erupting into violence. The balance between cooperation and conflict was fragile, shifting with each passing season. Hunting was an important skill, especially in the more remote areas. Men, and sometimes women, would set out at dawn with muskets or bows, tracking deer, elk, or wild turkey. A successful hunt could feed a family for days. Nothing was wasted. Meat was eaten, hides became clothing or blankets, bones were used for tools. The darkness was thick, and the sounds of nature, owl calls, rustling leaves, distant howls, were constant companions. Fires offered warmth and light, but also comfort. Around a fire, people told stories, some of their journey to this land, others of adventures or warnings passed down from older generations. Life on the edge of the colonies required courage and patience. The wilderness could not be tamed in a season or even in a lifetime. It was a constant teacher, offering both gifts and trials, and those who lived closest to it carried its lessons in their bones. If you closed your eyes here, you might imagine the crackle of a fire, the cool night air on your face, and the sense that beyond the circle of light, a vast and mysterious land waited, endless, silent, and full of promise. In every settlement, whether a small village by the coast or a cluster of cabins deep in the woods, there was work to be done from the moment the sun rose until it set again. The day often began before dawn. The first sound might be the creak of a wooden floor as someone stirred the embers in the hearth, coaxing them back to life for the morning's fire. Bread dough, prepared the night before, would be placed near the warmth to rise. Animals had to be fed before people could eat. A chorus of bleating goats, clucking hens, and the low bellow of cattle greeting the morning. On farms, the men and older boys would head to the fields, hoeing weeds from between rows of corn or checking the fences for gaps. The women tended kitchen gardens, gathering herbs and vegetables, or worked at spinning wheels, turning wool into yarn. Children, even the very young, had their share of tasks, fetching water from the well, gathering eggs, helping to grind grain for flour. In towns, the rhythm was different, but no less demanding. Blacksmiths struck their hammers against glowing iron, shaping nails, hinges, and horseshoes. Carpenters cut and smoothed planks for houses or furniture. Bakers worked in the heat of their ovens from early morning, sending the smell of fresh bread drifting into the streets. Midday meals were often shared together, with simple foods, stews, bread, and perhaps fruit if it was in season. On hot summer days, work slowed for a short time during the brightest hours, and some would rest in the shade of a tree, listening to the wind rustle the leaves. Every task, however small, had a purpose. Candles were dipped from tallow or beeswax. Even leisure often served a need, whittling a wooden toy for a child or weaving a basket to carry goods. There was a deep satisfaction in this way of life. Though the work was hard, it was tangible. Each effort left something visible behind. A field neatly planted, a barrel filled with salted fish, a roof repaired before the rain came. It was a life where the measure of a day's success could often be seen, touched, and tasted. As the sun began to sink, families gathered again. Tools were cleaned and stored. Supper was a time of quiet contentment, often the heartiest meal of the day, eaten by lamplight or firelight. When night fell, the world outside grew dark quickly, the only light from the stars and the moon. Inside, shadows danced on the walls as the fire flickered low. The hum of quiet conversation filled the room, or perhaps the soothing sound of a story being told. And when sleep came, it was the kind that follows honest work, deep, restful, and readying the body for another dawn. While work filled much of colonial life, there was also the need for learning. Education, in those early days, was a patchwork of efforts, sometimes organized, sometimes left to the home, always shaped by the realities of survival. In the more settled towns, small schoolhouses appeared, often just a single room with wooden benches, a simple desk for the teacher, and a slate board for lessons. Not every child could attend school every day. In farming families, the seasons dictated who was needed in the fields and when. Planting and harvest often meant long absences from lessons. Still, many parents valued learning enough to send their children whenever they could spare them from chores, not only for its teachings, but because it provided material for reading practice. Students learned to form letters with quill pens dipped in ink, to recite multiplication tables, and to memorize verses. For children in more remote areas, formal schooling might not be possible at all. Parents or older siblings taught the basics, how to read simple passages. Skills were often passed down through doing rather than through books, learning to plant seeds in straight rows. In wealthier families, especially in the larger towns, tutors were sometimes hired to provide a more complete education. Daughters, though often taught less formally, learned skills considered essential for running a household, as well as reading, writing, and sometimes even music. Despite the differences in access, there was a shared belief that knowledge could open doors. In a world where survival came first, whether in local government, the church, or trade, you might imagine, on a cold winter morning, the sound of boots crunching on snow as children made their way to the schoolhouse, their breath visible in the crisp air. Inside, the room smells faintly of wood smoke, and the teacher's voice carries over the quiet scratch of quills on paper. It is a scene both humble and full of promise, a reminder that even in a world ruled by hard labor, there was still time set aside for the mind to grow. Though the colonies were places of work and duty, they were also places of gathering. People understood the need to come together, not only to help each other, but to celebrate, to share news, and to keep spirits strong. Market days were among the most anticipated events. Farmers would load wagons with produce, eggs, cheese, and perhaps a small bundle of furs or handmade goods. Craftsmen brought tools, barrels, candles, or cloth from their workshops. The air in the town square would be filled with chatter, the sound of barter, and the warm greetings of neighbors who might not have seen one another in weeks. Children darted between stalls, eyes wide at the sight of brightly dyed ribbons or the smell of fresh gingerbread. Barn raisings were another kind of gathering, born from necessity but carried out with a spirit of joy. When a new barn was needed, neighbors came from miles around to help. The work was hard, lifting and setting the heavy wooden beams into place, but there was laughter and shared meals, and when the job was done, there was pride in what they had built together. Seasonal festivals brought a sense of tradition. In the autumn, harvest celebrations filled the air with music and the smell of roasting meat. In winter, there were simple Christmas gatherings, where candles glowed in windows and hymns were sung softly against the cold. In spring, planting feasts marked the beginning of the growing season, a way of asking for good fortune in the months ahead. Weddings were occasions of true joy, often lasting a full day. Friends and family gathered from far and near, bringing food, music, and gifts for the couple. They were times of remembering, of sharing stories about the one who had passed, and of supporting those left behind. These moments of fellowship were not mere distractions from work. They were part of the glue that held colonial life together. They gave people a sense of belonging, a reason to endure the harder days. If you listen closely in your mind, you might hear it, the sound of a fiddle drifting across the fields at dusk, the murmur of neighbors gathered by a long table, the soft creak of a chair as an elder tells a familiar story. These were the moments that reminded settlers why they had come and why they stayed. Faith played a central role in the lives of many colonists. For some, it was the very reason they had crossed the ocean, to find a place where they could worship freely, without fear of persecution. The meeting house was often the heart of a settlement. In other places, especially in larger towns, it might be sturdier and more elaborate, with tall windows to let in the light. Sunday was a day unlike any other. Work paused, except for the most necessary tasks, like tending to animals. Families would put on their cleanest clothing, often simple but carefully kept, and walk, sometimes for miles, to attend service. The roads might be muddy in spring, dusty in summer, or snowy in winter, but the journey was part of the rhythm of life. The sermons could be long, and the benches hard, but people listened intently. The minister's words were both instruction and reminder, lessons on morality, faith, and endurance. For children, the hours might stretch endlessly, their legs swinging beneath the bench, but even they absorbed the sense that this gathering was important. Religion also guided the calendar, but faith was not always uniform. Different colonies had different dominant religions: Puritans in New England, Quakers in Pennsylvania, Anglicans in Virginia, Catholics in Maryland. While there was sometimes tension between groups, there was also a growing understanding that many kinds of belief could exist side by side. This diversity would, in time, help shape the idea of religious freedom that became a cornerstone of the new nation. On quiet evenings, you might imagine a family gathered around the hearth, reading from the Bible by the flickering light of a candle. Outside, the night would be still, save for the wind in the trees. In those moments, faith was both comfort and compass, helping settlers navigate a life filled with both trials and blessings. Travel in the early colonies was neither quick nor easy. Roads, when they existed at all, were often little more than dirt paths, winding through forest and field. In wet weather, they turned to mud. In winter, they froze hard and rutted. Yet, despite the difficulties, people found ways to move from place to place. On foot, many journeys were taken, especially for short distances. A walk to a neighbor's farm might be only a mile or two, but could still feel like a small adventure, passing through meadows and woodlawns, hearing the rustle of leaves underfoot. Horseback travel was common for those who could afford a horse. Saddles were valued possessions, and riders carried saddlebags for food or supplies. On longer trips, inns and taverns offered places to rest both horse and rider. These roadside stops were more than just lodging. They were lively hubs where travelers exchanged news and stories from far-off towns. Carts and wagons were used to carry heavy loads, barrels of grain, bundles of furs, tools, or even entire families moving to a new settlement. The wheels creaked and groaned, and the pace was slow, but the sturdy wooden vehicles made it possible to transport what people could not carry themselves. In areas near rivers and the sea, boats were often the best means of travel. A small skiff could take someone quickly from one settlement to another, while larger vessels carried goods along the coast. Travel was not without risk. Storms could turn roads into deep, impassable mud. Rivers could flood, and snow could cut off entire villages. For these reasons, people often traveled in groups when they could, finding safety in company. Yet there was also a certain beauty in the slowness of travel. Along the way, one might stop at a farmhouse and be welcomed with a warm meal, or find shelter in a barn during a sudden rain. Travel connected the scattered settlements, binding them together with invisible threads of trade, family ties, and friendship. Without it, the colonies would have been isolated pockets. With it, they became part of a growing network of communities, each with its own story, yet linked to the others in ways both practical and deeply human. If you close your eyes, you might hear it, the steady clop of hooves on a dirt road, the creak of wagon wheels, the splash of oars in a calm river. It is the sound of a people on the move, shaping their future one slow mile at a time. Food in the early colonies was both a necessity and a comfort, a reflection of the land, the seasons, and the resourcefulness of those who lived there. What people ate depended greatly on where they lived, the time of year, and what they could grow, catch, or trade. Families grew vegetables like beans, squash, onions, and cabbage, along with herbs for flavor and medicine. Corn, introduced by native peoples, became a cornerstone of the colonial diet, ground into meal for bread, porridge, and pudding. Hunting and fishing provided meat and variety. In the forests, deer, rabbit, and wild turkey were prized, while rivers and coastal waters offered fish, clams, oysters, and crabs. Preserving these foods was essential. Meat was smoked or salted, fish dried for later use. Bread was a daily staple, baked in brick ovens or cooked on flat stones near the fire. In wealthier households, wheat flour was used, but in many homes, cornmeal or rye was more common. A fresh loaf, with its crust still warm from the oven, was often eaten with butter or honey. Dairy came from cows and goats, producing milk, cheese, and cream. Churning butter was a regular chore, its steady rhythm often accompanied by the hum of a song or the chatter of children nearby. Seasonal fruits, apples, berries, peaches, were enjoyed fresh when in season and preserved as jams or dried for the winter. Apple cider, sometimes fermented, was a common drink, safer than untreated water in many places. Meals were usually simple but filling. A midday meal might be a hearty stew with bread and a cup of cider. Supper could be roasted meat with vegetables from the garden, followed by baked apples or custard. Spices, when available, were treasured, adding warmth and flavor to otherwise plain dishes. Cooking was done over open hearths, which demanded skill and patience. Pots and kettles hung from iron hooks, and timing was learned by feel and experience rather than by clocks or written recipes. The kitchen was often the warmest room in the house, and in winter, it became the heart of family life, with everyone gathering near the fire while the day's meal simmered. Food was not just sustenance, it was a way of caring for one another. If you imagine it now, you might see a wooden table bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, the scent of fresh bread mingling with the steam from a kettle, and the quiet satisfaction of a day's work ending with a shared meal. It was a simple kind of abundance, one measured not by riches, but by warmth, nourishment, and the comfort of being together. The homes of the early colonists were as varied as the land they settled. Some were humble one-room cabins, while others, in more prosperous areas, were larger houses with multiple rooms and sturdier construction. In the earliest days, settlers often built with whatever materials were most readily available. In forested areas, log cabins were common. Thick logs, notched at the corners, formed the walls, with moss or clay packed into the gaps to keep out the wind. Roofs were covered with wooden shingles or thatch, and the floors might be simple packed earth at first. Near the coast, where stone was more plentiful, stone houses offered durability against storms and cold. These were sturdy, solid structures, their thick walls holding warmth in winter and coolness in summer. Inside, the hearth was the heart of the home. Around it, daily life unfolded, meals prepared, stories told, clothes mended, and quiet moments shared at the end of the day. Furniture was often handmade. A rough-hewn table, a few benches, perhaps a cupboard for dishes, and a chest for storing blankets. Beds were simple wooden frames with rope supports, topped with mattresses stuffed with straw, feathers, or corn husks. In wealthier homes, carved chairs, polished tables, and feather beds spoke of greater means, but even these homes were practical at their core. Windows were small, often covered with oiled paper before glass became more common. Light came from candles or oil lamps, their flickering glow casting long shadows on the walls. The smell of beeswax or tallow filled the air in the evenings. Outside, most homes had a small yard or garden, with herbs growing near the door and tools leaning against the wall. A well might stand nearby, its bucket and rope ready to draw fresh water. In some places, barns or sheds stood close to the house, so chores could be done without walking far in bad weather. Despite their simplicity, these homes were deeply personal spaces. They held the marks of each family's life, scratches on the table from years of use, a favorite chair near the fire, a quilt stitched by many hands. If you picture it now, you might see the soft light of dawn filtering through a small window, the faint smell of wood smoke in the air. Outside, the land waits, still and expectant, for another day to begin. In the colonies, clothing was more than just a matter of style. It was about practicality, durability, and the resources at hand. Each garment told a story of the hands that made it and the life it was meant to endure. Most clothing was handmade, either at home or by local tailors. In rural areas, families often raised sheep for wool or grew flax for linen. Wool was spun into yarn, dyed with natural colors from plants or roots, and woven into cloth. Linen, made from flax fibers, was cool and strong, perfect for shirts, shifts, and undergarments. Men typically wore breeches that reached the knee, paired with long stockings and sturdy leather shoes. Shirts were loose and often made of linen, with a waistcoat or coat for warmth. Wide-brimmed hats shaded them from the sun in summer and shed snow in winter. Women's clothing usually included long gowns or skirts with petticoats, an apron for daily tasks, and a bodice or stays for support. A linen shift was worn underneath, both for comfort and to keep outer garments cleaner. For warmth, women wore shawls or cloaks. And like the men, they covered their heads, often with a bonnet or simple linen cap. Children wore clothes similar to adults, though often simpler in style. Clothes were handed down from older siblings, patched and mended until they could no longer be worn. Shoes were valuable, often made by hand and meant to last. Boots were prized for travel and work in the fields. Weddings, church services, or important gatherings saw colonists wearing their best garments, perhaps a coat with polished brass buttons or a gown made from imported fabric. These pieces were treasured, often kept for years and passed down through generations. Clothing was cared for with great attention. Washing was labor-intensive, done by hand with lye soap and scrub boards, so garments were worn multiple times before being laundered. Mending was a constant task, with baskets of sewing waiting near the hearth in the evenings, her needle moving steadily through a piece of worn cloth, or a man polishing the buckles of his shoes for Sunday service. The scent of wool warmed by the hearth, the faint color of plant-dyed fabric, and the quiet satisfaction of making something last, all were part of life in the early colonies. The changing seasons shaped life in the colonies in ways both practical and deeply felt. Each turn of the year brought its own tasks, challenges, and small joys, marking the steady rhythm of life. Spring was a season of renewal and preparation. As the frost melted and the earth softened, fields were plowed and seeds were sown. Farmers worked from dawn to dusk, knowing that the success of the year's harvest depended on these early weeks. Fruit trees blossomed, filling the air with delicate fragrance, and streams swelled with melted snow. For many, spring was also a time of hope, of new beginnings after the hardships of winter. Summer brought long days and a flurry of activity. Gardens grew quickly, and the fields needed constant tending. Fishing and hunting were plentiful, and households busied themselves with preserving food for the colder months ahead. Children helped gather berries, while women worked to dry herbs, smoke meat, and store away barrels of salted fish. Fields were heavy with grain, orchards with apples, and gardens with the last of the vegetables. Winter was a time of both hardship and rest. Families gathered near the hearth, mending clothes, carving tools, or telling stories by candlelight. Food was drawn from carefully stored supplies, and meals were planned to stretch through the cold months. Though the days were short, winter carried a certain peace, the quiet beauty of a landscape asleep, and the closeness of family sharing warmth against the chill. And resting was as natural to them as breathing. If you picture it now, you might see the same homestead across 4 different scenes, the fresh green of spring fields. Each season a chapter, each year a story in the life of those who called the colonies home. Trade and barter were the lifeblood of the early colonies, connecting isolated settlements and allowing people to obtain goods they could not produce themselves. In a time when coins were scarce and paper money was still a rarity, farmers might bring bushels of corn, wheat, or vegetables to town. A skilled blacksmith could exchange horseshoes or iron nails for fresh produce or meat. Fishermen swapped barrels of salted fish for grain or leather goods. Every item had value, and people learned to judge worth carefully, balancing what they had against what they needed. Markets and trading posts were bustling places. Wooden stalls held baskets of apples, stacks of homespun cloth, jars of honey, and coils of rope. The air was filled with voices, bargaining, laughing, sharing news. Children watched eagerly as rare items appeared, bright-colored beads, imported spices, or a small tin whistle. Ships from England, the West Indies, and other parts of the world brought tea, sugar, molasses, fine cloth, and manufactured tools. In return, colonial exports included tobacco, timber, furs, and fish. The sight of a ship's sails on the horizon was often cause for excitement. A neighbor might mend a roof in exchange for help building a fence. A woman skilled in spinning could trade yarn for fresh eggs or a jar of preserves. These exchanges strengthened community ties, weaving relationships as valuable as the goods themselves. Trade was not without its challenges. Bad weather could delay ships, poor harvests could limit supplies, and disputes sometimes arose over value. Yet the system worked because it was built on trust and mutual need. If you imagine it now, you might see the marketplace on a bright morning, the sound of wagon wheels over cobblestones, the warmth of hands meeting in a firm handshake to seal a deal. It was about connection, about the way lives intertwined in the daily act of giving and receiving. These trades were the backbone of colonial towns, each one essential in its own way. The blacksmith was among the most important. His forge was a place of heat, sparks, and steady hammer blows. Here, he shaped iron into tools, nails, hinges, plow blades, and horseshoes. The blacksmith's work touched nearly every part of daily life, and his skill was respected by all. The carpenter built homes, barns, and furniture, with saw, plane, and chisel. Every settlement relied on carpenters to keep buildings safe and functional. The cooper made barrels, casks, and tubs, containers that were vital for storing everything from grain to fish to cider. A well-made barrel was as important to trade and storage as any tool, keeping goods safe during long journeys. The weaver worked at a loom, turning spun thread into cloth. In homes, smaller looms produced household fabrics, but professional weavers could create finer cloth for clothing and trade. The steady rhythm of the loom was a familiar sound in many towns. The miller operated the grist mill, where grain was ground into flour or meal, often located by a river or stream. The mill was a gathering place as farmers brought their harvest to be processed. The turning of the great water wheel was both a sign of progress and a reminder of nature as power. The tanner worked with hides, transforming them into leather for shoes, belts, harnesses, and other goods. Though the work carried strong smells from the tanning process, it was an essential trade that supported daily life and travel. Beyond these, there were shoemakers, tailors, potters, and apothecaries, each adding their skill to the fabric of colonial society. Many of these trades were learned through apprenticeship, with young boys working alongside masters for years, earning their keep while absorbing the craft. These skilled workers were more than just service providers. They were neighbors, friends, and essential parts of the community's survival. In many cases, they accepted payment not only in coin but in goods, creating a network of mutual support. If you picture it now, you might see the glow of a forge in the early morning, the steady thump of a hammer, the smell of fresh cut wood curling in the air, or the creak of a mill wheel turning over the water. These were the sounds and scents of work that kept the colonies alive. Without modern hospitals or advanced treatments, colonists relied on a mix of European medical traditions, Native American remedies, and home-based care passed down through families. Illness could strike at any time, and even minor ailments carried risks. A simple fever or infection might become life-threatening without proper treatment. In the absence of trained physicians, who were often scarce outside the largest towns, settlers depended on local healers, midwives, and their own resourcefulness. Herbal remedies were the first line of defense. Plants like willow bark were used for pain relief, peppermint for digestive troubles, and chamomile for calming the nerves. Many of these cures had been used for centuries in Europe, while others were learned from native peoples, whose knowledge of local plants was extensive. Midwives played an essential role in childbirth, guiding mothers through labor and providing care for newborns. They also offered advice on general health, acting as trusted figures in their communities. When a physician was available, treatments could be a mix of helpful and harmful. Practices such as bloodletting, purging, and the use of strong substances like mercury were common, based on the medical theories of the time. While some patients recovered, others were weakened by these harsh methods. Poultices for wounds, and stitched sutures made by skilled hands. Sanitation was not yet well understood, so infection remained a constant danger. Preventive care often meant simply maintaining strength through good food, warmth, and rest. In winter, keeping a steady fire was as much a health measure as a comfort. Fresh air, clean water, and exercise through daily labor also helped keep illness at bay. When sickness swept through a settlement, whether from influenza, smallpox, or other contagious diseases, it could spread quickly. Quarantine was sometimes used. In these times, recovery was often as much about spirit as it was about treatment. The comfort of a warm meal, the steady voice of a loved one reading by the bedside, or the quiet presence of a neighbor sitting in watch through the night could be as healing as any medicine. If you imagine it now, you might see a dimly lit room, the scent of herbs hanging in the air, a small fire casting gentle shadows, and the soft rustle of someone tending to a patient. In those moments, care was not a profession, it was an act of love and endurance. The relationship between the colonists and the native peoples was one of the most complex and defining aspects of early American life. It was a connection marked by moments of friendship and cooperation, as well as periods of tension and deep misunderstanding. When the first settlers arrived, many were unprepared for the challenges of survival in an unfamiliar land. They taught colonists how to grow corn, beans, and squash together in a way that kept the soil fertile. They showed where to fish, hunt, and gather edible plants. They offered cures made from local herbs, and shared skills like making birch bark canoes and snowshoes. In return, colonists traded goods from Europe, metal tools, blankets, beads, and firearms. These items became part of native life, just as native foods and practices became part of colonial life. For a time, trade and mutual benefit bound the two groups together. But as more settlers arrived, the demand for land grew. Forests were cut for farms, rivers were diverted for mills, and hunting grounds were claimed for towns. Disputes over territory became more common, and cultural differences, different ideas about ownership, leadership, and justice, added to the strain. In some places, alliances were formed, whether from rival tribes or competing European powers. In others, conflict flared into violence, with tragic losses on both sides. Despite these challenges, moments of genuine understanding and friendship did exist. Some colonists learned native languages and customs, and some native individuals lived among the settlers, bridging two worlds. Colonial expansion pushed native peoples further from their ancestral lands, and the exchanges that had once been based on mutual need became increasingly one-sided. It is a history both rich with cooperation and shadowed by sorrow. If you picture it now, and the exchange of goods, a bundle of furs for a metal axe, a pouch of corn for a small glass mirror, a reminder that in the vast wilderness, survival often depended on the willingness to listen and to share. Faith and religion shaped the rhythm of life. In the early colonies, just as much as the changing seasons or the work of the fields. For many settlers, the journey across the ocean had been inspired by a desire for religious freedom, though what that meant often depended on who you asked. In New England, Puritans sought to build communities grounded in their interpretation of the Bible. Sunday was the most sacred day of the week. and the sound of the meeting house bell could be heard across the village. Families dressed in their best, walking through the crisp morning air to attend long hours of worship. The sermons were solemn, filled with moral instruction and reminders of the challenges of living a righteous life. In other regions, like Pennsylvania, the Quakers embraced a quieter, more inward form of worship. They believed in the inner light within each person, and their meetings often began in silence, with members speaking only when moved by the Spirit. The whitewashed buildings often stood at the heart of town, and afterward, neighbors lingered outside to exchange news before returning to their plantations and farms. Religion also played a role in education, as reading the Bible was often the first reason children learned their letters. Psalms and scripture were woven into daily lessons, and moral values were passed along with practical skills. For many colonists, faith was a source of comfort in hard times, a way to make sense of illness, loss, and uncertainty. Prayer was said before meals, before bed, and before setting out on dangerous journeys. In moments of joy, such as a good harvest or the birth of a child, gratitude was often expressed through worship. Still, religious life in the colonies was not without its divisions. Different beliefs sometimes caused tension between groups. The sound of hymns and the sight of neighbors gathered for worship was a familiar part of the week. If you imagine it now, you might see a small wooden meeting house on a winter morning, its windows frosted, a curl of smoke rising from the chimney, as if holding the village in a quiet embrace. Education in the early colonies was a patchwork of opportunity, shaped by location, resources, and the values of each community. In some places, schooling was highly prized and well-organized. In New England, where the Puritans placed great importance on reading the Bible, towns were often required by law to provide schools. These were simple one-room buildings with wooden benches, a blackboard, and a single teacher who taught all ages together. Lessons began early and lasted until the afternoon. A wooden paddle with a printed sheet protected by a thin layer of horn. In rural areas or in the southern colonies, formal schools were fewer. Wealthier families often hired private tutors or sent their sons to schools in larger towns. Girls were more likely to be educated at home. Still, in many homes, if parents could read and write, they passed those skills to their children by the firelight after a day's work. Apprenticeships were another important form of education. A boy might be sent to live with a master craftsman, learning a trade such as carpentry, printing, or shoemaking. In return for his labor, he received training, food, and a place to sleep. For many, this was the path to independence and a secure livelihood. Schooling could be strict. Teachers expected discipline, and misbehavior was met with firm correction. Yet there were also moments of warmth, the shared laughter during a spelling bee, the pride of mastering a difficult passage, or the rare treat of a half-day when the weather was fine. The smell of chalk and wood smoke fills the air. Children's voices recite lessons in unison, their breath clouding the cold morning air inside the room. Outside, the wind rattles the bare branches, but inside, learning is taking root, slowly, steadily, preparing young minds for the world beyond the door. The changing seasons shaped every part of colonial life, weaving a steady rhythm into the days and months. In a time without electric lights, central heating, or rapid travel, people lived closely in step with the natural world. Spring was a season of hope and hard work. As the snow melted, streams ran high, and the soil softened under the sun, fields were prepared for planting. The air carried the scent of fresh earth, and the first shoots of green lifted spirits after the long, gray winter. Summer brought longer days and endless labor, and fishing was at its best. Children gathered berries in the woods while the hum of insects filled the warm air. Evenings were a time for cooling off on the porch, telling stories, and watching the sun dip low over the fields. Autumn was a time of gathering and storing, and vegetables were laid in root cellars. It was also a season of quiet celebration, neighbors helping each other bring in the last sheaves of grain, sharing in the bounty before the frost returned. Winter slowed the pace, but brought its own demands. Snow lay heavy on rooftops, and the world outside grew silent except for the creak of frozen branches or the crunch of footsteps on ice. Families stayed close to the hearth, mending clothes, carving tools, or spinning wool. Meals were hearty and simple, drawn from the stored provisions carefully set aside in the fall. The first frost might mean the end of tender crops, the first robin, the return of warmth. A good harvest brought relief. If you picture it now, you might see the soft gold of autumn leaves drifting to the ground, or the shimmering green of fields in spring. Each season had its beauty, its hardships, and its quiet rewards, and in the early colonies, they were felt more deeply because nothing could be rushed, shaped by what people could create with their own hands or share with one another. There were no theaters, no grand concerts, no printed novels arriving by the cartload, only the resourcefulness of a community that knew how to make its own joy. Storytelling was at the heart of it. In the glow of a fire, neighbors and family members would gather to tell tales, some handed down from the old world, others born from life in the new. There were stories of shipwrecks and survival, of strange animals seen in the woods, and of ancestors whose courage was almost too great to believe. Each teller gave the story their own touch, and with each retelling, the details shifted like patterns in a quilt. Music was made with whatever instruments could be found or crafted. A fiddle, a simple flute, or a drum could bring people together for dancing on a summer evening. Songs from England, Scotland, Ireland, and Africa mingled in the air, creating a blend of traditions that was uniquely colonial. Sometimes, the music was just the rhythm of hands clapping and feet tapping on wooden floors. Games and sports filled the daylight hours, especially for children. They played tag, hide and seek, and hoop rolling. Adults joined in contests of strength like wrestling or tug of war. Seasonal gatherings gave people a reason to celebrate. A successful harvest might be followed by a communal feast, where tables were crowded with pies, roasted meats, and warm cider. Weddings were also occasions for dancing, singing, and laughter that could last late into the night. Even the work itself sometimes became entertainment. A barn raising was both labor and festivity, men lifting beams while women prepared tables heavy with food, children running underfoot until the last nail was hammered in place. Without books, radio, or screens, entertainment relied on presence, being there, hearing the music in person, seeing the storyteller's expression, feeling the warmth of shared laughter. It was a kind of joy that lingered long after the evening ended. If you picture it now, you might see a circle of friends by the fire, a fiddler playing a bright tune, the scent of wood smoke mixing with the aroma of fresh bread, and the soft hum of voices rising and falling together. In that moment, the harshness of colonial life seemed to fade. Travel in the early colonies was neither quick nor easy. Roads were little more than dirt paths, often rutted, muddy, or blocked by fallen trees. In spring, they could turn to deep mire after heavy rains. In winter, they might be buried under snow or frozen into jagged ridges of ice. Still, people found ways to keep moving, because trade, community ties, and necessity demanded it. Walking was the most common form of travel. Settlers thought little of walking several miles to visit a neighbor, attend church, or trade goods. Sturdy boots were essential, and journeys began early to take advantage of daylight. Horseback travel was quicker but required the means to keep and feed a horse. Saddles and bridles were often handmade, and a good horse was considered a valuable possession, sometimes more precious than a fine piece of furniture or silver. Carts and wagons carried heavier loads. They creaked and jolted over uneven ground, their iron-rimmed wheels biting into the soil. A trip that might take us less than an hour today could take half a day or more for a colonial wagon. For longer distances, boats and canoes were often the most reliable choice. Rivers and coastal waters served as highways, carrying goods and people more swiftly than overland travel could manage. Canoes, especially those made in the native style from hollowed logs or birch bark, were nimble and well-suited to winding waterways. Larger vessels, like small sloops or trading boats, connected distant towns and even carried goods to other colonies or across the Atlantic. Travel always came with a sense of preparation and risk. Weather could change quickly, and there were few inns or shelters along the way. A traveler might carry food wrapped in cloth, a small blanket for warmth, and perhaps a flint to start a fire if night fell before reaching home. Yet there was also a quiet beauty to these journeys. Paths through the forest opened to unexpected views, a sparkling brook, a meadow alive with wildflowers, or the far-off sight of a church steeple marking the edge of a town. Along rivers, the sound of water lapping against the boat's side was steady and soothing. the banks lined with tall grass and willow trees that dipped into the current. If you imagine it now, you might see a lone rider moving slowly along a wooded trail, the light filtering down through leaves, the sound of hooves muffled by the soft earth. Or perhaps a small canoe gliding over still water at dusk, the air cool and fragrant with pine. Travel was not only a necessity, it was, in its own way, a meditation on the vast and untamed land that surrounded the early colonists. Food in the early colonies was both a comfort and a challenge. The rhythm of the seasons decided what was on the table, and the skill of the household determined how well it would last through the year. Bread was a staple, baked from cornmeal, rye, or wheat when available. In many regions, corn was the most reliable grain, ground into meal for cornbread, johnnycakes, and porridges. Meat came from hunting, fishing, and raising livestock. Venison, rabbit, and wild fowl were common in frontier areas, while coastal settlements enjoyed fish, clams, and oysters. Chickens provided both meat and eggs, and pigs were valued for their ability to thrive on little food. Colonists grew beans, peas, squash, and root vegetables like turnips and carrots. Apples were especially treasured. They could be eaten fresh, baked into pies, dried for storage, or pressed into cider. Berries and nuts were gathered in season, their flavors bright reminders of summer during the colder months. Dairy products, milk, butter, and cheese, were staples on many farms. Butter was churned by hand, often in the cool of the morning, and cheese-making turned surplus milk into a food that could be kept for months. Preservation was a vital skill. Root cellars kept vegetables cool and fresh. Jars of pickled cucumbers and beets added variety to winter meals. Meats were cured with salt or smoked in small sheds, while fruits might be dried in the sun or boiled down into thick jams. Meals were simple but filling. A typical supper might be a stew of meat and vegetables served with fresh bread, followed by baked apples or a slice of pie. On special occasions, tables were crowded with roast meats, puddings, and sweet treats flavored with spices brought from overseas, precious reminders of distant lands. If you imagine it now, you might see a wooden table lit by candlelight, steam rising from a pot of stew, the scent of fresh bread mixing with wood smoke. Outside, the night air is cool and still, but inside there is warmth, laughter, and the deep satisfaction of a well-earned meal. Clothing in the early colonies was more than just a matter of fashion. It was a careful balance of necessity, durability, and the resources available. Every piece had to be made to last, and often it was the work of many hands before it was ready to wear. For men, clothing typically included breeches, a shirt, a waistcoat, and a coat for colder months. Shirts were usually made from linen, woven at home or imported, and served as both undergarment and outerwear in the heat of summer. And sturdy wool stockings kept legs warm. Wide-brimmed hats shielded the face from sun and rain, and leather shoes, often made by local cobblers, completed the outfit. For women, the basic garments were a long gown or a bodice with a skirt, worn over a linen shift. Aprons protected clothing during daily work. In winter, women layered woolen shawls or cloaks over their dresses, sometimes lined with fur for extra warmth. Children's clothing was simpler but often mirrored adult styles. Young boys might wear gowns until they were old enough for breeches, while girls wore smaller versions of women's dresses. Clothes were handed down from one child to another, patched and mended as long as the fabric held together. Materials varied by region and wealth. Cotton was less common early on, arriving in small amounts through trade. Leather was used for shoes, belts, and work garments, while fur-lined coats were prized in colder climates. Because fabric was precious, garments were carefully maintained. A tear was mended before it could grow, and worn-out clothing might be cut down for children or turned into quilts and rags. Dyeing cloth with natural colors, made from plants, berries, and roots, added variety, though many garments remained in muted shades of brown, gray, and blue. Special occasions called for finer attire. Men might wear coats with polished buttons and women gowns trimmed with lace or ribbons. These garments were often kept for years, brought out only for church, weddings, or celebrations. If you imagine it now, you might see a woman sitting by the hearth in the evening, needle in hand, mending her husband's shirt by the glow of the fire. Outside, the wind whistles through the trees. But inside, The steady rhythm of her stitching is as comforting as the warmth from the flames. While many families produced much of what they needed themselves, a farmer might exchange a bushel of apples for a length of homespun cloth, or a cooper might trade a barrel for a supply of fish. In smaller settlements, coin was rare, and goods themselves became a kind of currency. Market days were highlights of the week. Villagers would gather in the central square or along a main street. The air would hum with conversation, the clink of metal tools, and the calls of merchants praising their wares. Market days were also social occasions, a chance to hear news, arrange future trades, and strengthen bonds between neighbors. Beyond local exchanges, regional trade linked towns across the colonies. Wagons carried grain, tobacco, and lumber from inland farms to coastal ports. From there, ships transported goods along the coast or across the Atlantic. The triangular trade connected the colonies to Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe. From New England, ships carried rum and goods to Africa, traded for enslaved people, who were then transported to the Caribbean and sold. The ships returned with sugar and molasses to make more rum, completing the grim cycle. Imports from Europe included cloth, glassware, fine tools, books, and spices. These were prized items, often arriving after long months at sea. Families who could afford such goods treasured them. If you imagine it now, you might see a small port town at dawn. Ships rest at anchor, their sails furled, while dockworkers unload barrels of salted fish, stacks of timber, and crates stamped with distant names. In the marketplace, the smell of fresh bread mingles with the salt air, and the voices of traders rise and fall like the tide. Trade was not just the exchange of goods. It was the heartbeat of a growing society, a bridge between the familiar and the unknown. Law and order in the early colonies were shaped by both old-world traditions and the unique challenges of life in a new land. Each settlement needed rules to keep peace, protect property, and guide daily behavior. Yet the way those rules were made and enforced varied from colony to colony. In New England, many towns held regular meetings where male property owners could vote on local matters. Laws often reflected both civil needs and religious values. Southern colonies tended to follow a more hierarchical system, with county courts overseeing local disputes. Wealthy landowners often held influence, and laws focused on protecting property, especially land and enslaved labor, while also addressing crimes like theft or assault. Punishments could be severe by today's standards. For minor offenses, fines or time in the stocks were common. Stocks were wooden frames that locked a person's hands and head in place in the center of town, leaving them exposed to public shame. More serious crimes might result in whipping, branding, or even banishment from the community. For the gravest offenses, murder, treason, or repeated theft, the penalty could be death, usually by hanging. Though such punishments were rare, their presence served as a stern warning to others. Law enforcement was handled by constables, sheriffs, or night watchmen. These positions were often part-time roles held by ordinary citizens, chosen by the community. There were no large police forces. So much depended on neighbors keeping watch over one another. In small settlements, harmony was more than just a virtue. It was a necessity for survival. If you imagine it now, you might see a town square on a bright morning, the wooden stocks casting a long shadow. Children might glance curiously at a man seated there for public drunkenness, while townsfolk go about their errands. The scene is quiet, yet it carries a reminder. In the early colonies, the law was not distant. It was visible, immediate, and woven into the daily life of every settler. Life was full of work, and there were few chances to set aside the demands of farming, building, and trade. When a holiday arrived, it was more than a day of rest. It was a moment to gather, give thanks, and strengthen the bonds of community. Religious holidays were often the most widely observed. In New England, Puritan settlers did not celebrate Christmas in the way we think of it today. To them, it was a holy day, stripped of the feasting and merriment common in England. Instead, they placed more emphasis on days of thanksgiving, times to pause after a good harvest or deliverance from hardship, offering prayers, and sharing simple meals in gratitude. In the middle and southern colonies, where traditions varied more widely, Christmas might be celebrated with church services, visiting neighbors, and enjoying special foods. In wealthier households, it could also mean music, dancing, and the exchange of small gifts. Weddings were joyous events in every colony. Though the ceremonies were often simple, the celebrations afterward could be lively. Neighbors brought food, musicians played, and the dancing might go on late into the night. It was a time when even the most reserved communities allowed themselves laughter and cheer, marking the successful gathering of crops before winter. Tables groaned under roasted meats, pies, and fresh bread, and the air was filled with the warmth of shared accomplishment. Some celebrations came from old European traditions, May Day with its flowers and ribbons, or midsummer gatherings around a bonfire. Others were unique to the New World, born from the shared experiences of survival and cooperation. For enslaved Africans in the southern colonies, celebrations took on a different shape. Though they lived under oppression, they found ways to mark important occasions through music, dance, and the preservation of cultural traditions that reminded them of home. These moments were rare and hard-won, but they carried deep meaning. If you imagine it now, you might see a group of neighbors gathered in a clearing on a crisp autumn afternoon. Children run between tables laden with food, and the smell of roasted meat mingles with the sweet scent of apples. The hardships of daily life seem, for a moment, far away, replaced by the simple joy of being together. Weather in the early colonies was more than a topic of conversation. It was a constant presence, shaping every decision and determining both comfort and survival. Without accurate forecasts or modern shelter, settlers learned to read the signs in the sky, the wind, and the behavior of animals. Winter in the northern colonies could be long and harsh. Snow piled deep against doors, and icy winds rattled the shutters. The cold seeped into even the most tightly built homes, making a steady fire essential. Yet with the thaw came the return of birdsong, the first tender shoots of green, and the promise of planting season. Summer was a time of abundance, and also heat and storms. Thunder rolled over the hills, and sudden rains could drench fields in minutes. Farmers worked long hours under the sun, always aware that a dry spell or too much rain could mean a poor harvest. Autumn was perhaps the most beloved season. The air turned crisp, the leaves blazed in gold and red, and the heavy work of harvest brought both satisfaction and relief. Still, the shortening days were a reminder that winter's cold was approaching once again. Storms were part of life in every season. In coastal regions, hurricanes could batter ships and wash away homes. Inland, blizzards might trap families for days. Lightning could strike a barn or a tall tree, and the loss could be devastating. Because the weather was so unpredictable, colonists prepared carefully. Firewood was stacked high before winter, food stores checked and replenished, and tools repaired while the skies were still fair. A wise household always planned for the worst while hoping for the best. If you imagine it now, you might see a farmer standing in his doorway at dawn, looking out at the sky. The air is heavy, the clouds dark and low. He knows by the smell of the wind and the restlessness of the animals that a storm is coming. And so, he calls to his family. And together they work quickly, securing the roof, gathering the animals, and making ready, because in the early colonies, the weather was not something you endured casually. It was a force you learned to live alongside. Travel in the early colonies was a slow, deliberate affair. Roads, when they existed at all, were often little more than dirt paths, winding through forests, across streams, and over uneven ground. For most settlers, a journey of even a few miles was not something taken lightly. On foot, people could cover only a few miles in a day, especially if they carried heavy loads or had to navigate steep terrain. On horseback, travel was faster but still unpredictable. Horses had to be carefully tended, watered, and fed along the way. Riders might stop at small taverns or inns if their route passed near a settlement, but often they relied on the hospitality of strangers or friends met along the road. In some places, ferries operated to carry travelers and goods across wide rivers, but these too depended on fair weather and steady water. Along the coast and major rivers, boats and small ships provided an alternative to land travel. Water routes could be faster and allowed for the transport of heavier goods, but they carried their own dangers, storms, shifting tides, and hidden shoals. Travelers often carried their own provisions, for they could not rely on finding supplies along the way. With the fire keeping both the cold and wild animals at bay, journeys between colonies could take weeks. Letters traveled the same slow paths. sometimes arriving long after the news within had lost its urgency. Because of this, the arrival of a traveler was often greeted with eager faces. He carried not just goods, but stories, news, and a living connection to places far away. If you picture it now, you might see a narrow forest road at dusk. A wagon creaks along, its wheels groaning, lanterns swaying gently with the motion. The driver hums softly to himself, watching the path ahead. In the early colonies, travel was never quick, but it was a thread that wove distant lives together. Education in the early colonies was shaped by necessity, faith, and the resources at hand. Not every child had the same opportunity to learn, and what was taught depended greatly on where a family lived. In New England, especially in Puritan communities, education was closely tied to religion. Settlers believed that everyone should be able to read the Bible for themselves. This led to the creation of small village schools, often one-room buildings where children of all ages learned together. Lessons focused on reading, writing, and arithmetic, with religious instruction woven into every subject. In the middle colonies, education was more varied, reflecting the diversity of the people who lived there. Dutch, German, English, and Quaker communities all had their own traditions. Some children attended church-run schools, while others learned at home from their parents. In larger towns, private tutors might be hired for wealthier families. In the southern colonies, where plantations were spread far apart, formal schooling was rare for most children. Wealthy families sometimes sent their children to England for education or hired tutors to teach them at home. Poorer children learned skills from their parents, how to farm, hunt, or manage a household, rather than from books. For girls, education was often limited to reading, writing, and household skills. The belief was that their main role would be to manage a home and raise children. Yet some girls, particularly in wealthier families, were taught more, including music, sewing, and perhaps even a bit of history. For enslaved Africans and their children, education was usually denied by law or custom, especially in the southern colonies. Still, knowledge found ways to pass quietly from one person to another: songs, stories, and shared wisdom that could not be taken away. School days were far from easy. Children wrote with quill pens dipped in ink, practiced their sums on slates, and sat on hard wooden benches from morning until afternoon. The room might be chilly in winter, with only a small fire to provide warmth, and stifling in summer, with flies buzzing at the windows. Yet for many families, even this humble education was a source of pride. To read a book, to write a letter. If you imagine it now, you might see a small schoolhouse at the edge of a clearing. Smoke curls from its chimney, and inside, a dozen children bend over their work. But within those walls, knowledge takes root, shaping the future in quiet ways. Health and medicine in the early colonies were a mix of practical knowledge, old-world traditions, and a fair share of superstition. Without modern hospitals or trained doctors nearby, most families relied on home remedies, shared wisdom, and the care of neighbors when illness struck. Common ailments like fevers, coughs, toothaches, and stomach troubles were treated with herbs grown in the garden or gathered from the forest. Chamomile tea soothed the stomach, willow bark eased pain, and mint leaves were used for headaches. Colonists learned much of this plant knowledge from the indigenous peoples, whose understanding of the land's healing properties was far greater than their own. When sickness was more serious, a town might call upon a physician, if one lived nearby. These doctors often traveled from home to home, carrying a small case of tools and medicines. Treatments could be harsh by today's standards, bleeding to balance the humors, purging with strong herbs, or applying heated cups to draw out illness. Midwives played a vital role in the colonies, especially in rural areas. They brought new life into the world, cared for mothers, and often served as healers for other ailments. Their skill and experience were trusted far and wide, for in many places, they were the only medical help within miles. Serious epidemics were among the greatest fears of colonial life. Smallpox, dysentery, and yellow fever could sweep through a settlement, leaving devastation in their wake. Without understanding germs, people turned to isolation, prayers, and whatever remedies they could find. Accidents were another constant danger. A cut from an axe, a fall from a horse, or a burn from the hearth could quickly become life-threatening if infection set in. Clean water and proper sanitation were often scarce, making prevention as important as any cure. And yet, for all the hardships, there was resilience. Families supported one another, communities rallied in times of need, and the simplest recovery, a child's fever breaking, a wound healing, was cause for quiet celebration. If you imagine it now, you might see a small cabin on a snowy night. Inside, a mother sits beside her child's bed, gently wiping a fevered brow with a cloth dipped in cool water. The light from the hearth flickers across the walls, and outside, the wind sighs through the trees. In moments like this, health was not just a matter of medicine. It was an act of care, patience, and hope. Art and music in the early colonies were shaped by necessity, tradition, and the deep human desire to create beauty, even in a world filled with hard work and uncertainty. While survival was the priority, people still found time for songs, stories, and craftwork that brought warmth to their communities. Music was often woven into daily life. In New England, hymns were sung in churches, their simple melodies carrying through the wooden pews. Many settlers brought old folk songs from their homelands, English ballads, Scottish reels, Irish jigs, and sang them by the fireside on winter nights. In the middle and southern colonies, fiddles, flutes, and drums sometimes accompanied dances during weddings or festivals. Enslaved Africans carried with them rich musical traditions, blending rhythms and melodies from their homeland with new influences from the colonies. Their music, often made with hand drums, clapping, and call-and-response singing, was a source of strength, identity, and hope. Over time, these sounds would become part of the very fabric of American culture. Art took many forms, though it was rarely for decoration alone. Quilts were stitched not just for warmth, but with patterns that told stories or honored family traditions. Pottery was both practical and beautiful, with careful shaping and painted designs. Skilled woodworkers carved furniture, tools, and even toys, each with its own unique touch. Portrait painting was reserved for the wealthy, who could afford to hire an artist to capture their likeness. These portraits were symbols of status and permanence in a land where life could be unpredictable. Meanwhile, everyday settlers might decorate their homes with simple carvings, painted chests, or woven baskets, each item telling its own quiet story. Storytelling was another art form that required no tools but memory and voice. Around the hearth, tales were told of life in the old country, of legendary heroes, of cautionary lessons for children, and of strange happenings in the forests and rivers of the New World. If you imagine it now, you might see a small group gathered in a dimly lit room on a winter's evening. A fiddle plays a gentle tune while a woman hums along, her hands busy with needle and thread. Nearby, a young boy carves a toy boat from a scrap of wood, listening as his grandfather begins a story. The air is warm with the glow of the fire, and outside, the snow falls silently, as if the world itself is pausing to listen. Religion in the early colonies was a guiding force, shaping not only personal beliefs but also laws, customs, and community life. For many settlers, the journey across the ocean had been driven by the hope of worshiping freely, away from the strict control or persecution they faced in Europe. In New England, Puritan congregations sought to build what they saw as a godly community. Churches were simple, unadorned buildings, reflecting their belief that worship should be plain and focused entirely on Scripture. Attendance was not optional. Everyone was expected to be present for long services, sometimes lasting most of the day. In the middle colonies, religion was more diverse. Quakers in Pennsylvania preached equality, peace, and simplicity. This diversity made the middle colonies some of the most religiously tolerant places in early America. For planters and wealthy families, church was not only a place of worship, but also a place to socialize, conduct business, and reinforce community ties. Religion was not just a matter of Sunday worship. It was woven into daily life. Prayers were said at meals, scripture was read aloud in the evenings, and moral codes influenced everything from how neighbors treated one another to the punishments handed down by courts. For enslaved Africans, religion took on a dual role. Some converted to Christianity, blending its teachings with spiritual traditions from their homeland. Others held on to African beliefs in secret, passing down stories and songs that preserved their heritage. Faith, in whatever form it took, became a source of strength amid hardship. If you imagine it now, you might see a small meeting house on a crisp autumn morning. Families arrive on foot or by wagon, their footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. The minister begins to speak, his voice steady and strong, carrying a message meant to guide hearts and lives in a land still finding its way. In a world without telephones, telegraphs, or quick postal systems, news traveled on horseback, by foot, or aboard ships that might take weeks or months to arrive. Letters were precious, writing supplies were costly, and not everyone could read or write. A letter might carry news of a birth, a marriage, or a death, carrying letters between settlements. They followed rough roads, braved bad weather, and sometimes crossed dangerous territories. In smaller or more remote areas, letters might be sent along with a traveling neighbor or entrusted to a merchant heading toward another colony. Newspapers existed, but they were limited in number and range. Printing presses were expensive, and only larger towns could support them. The first colonial newspapers were often just a single sheet, filled with notices of ships arriving, goods for sale, public meetings, and major events from Europe. Much news still spread by word of mouth. A traveler stopping at a tavern could become the center of attention, with locals eager to hear the latest from other towns. In marketplaces and churchyards, people gathered to share what they had heard, weaving together a patchwork of stories, facts, and sometimes rumors. This slow pace of communication meant that communities were often self-reliant. It also meant that when news finally did arrive, it was an event in itself. Gatherings would form, letters would be read aloud, and important updates might be posted in a public square for all to see. If you imagine it now, you might see a rider arriving in a small village at dusk. His horse is tired, its breath steaming in the cool air. He dismounts, hands a folded letter to a waiting man, and soon the whole household gathers inside by candlelight to hear it read. The words may be old by the time they are heard, but in that moment, they feel as fresh and alive as if they had just been spoken. Leisure in the early colonies was rare, but when the work was done, or at least set aside for a while, people found ways to rest, enjoy themselves, and strengthen bonds within the community. Even in a world where survival came first, there was an understanding that the spirit needed its own kind of nourishment. For children, leisure often meant play that mimicked the adult world. They carved small boats to float in streams, made dolls from corn husks or scraps of cloth. In winter, they slid down snowy hills on wooden sleds or frozen pieces of bark. Adults found enjoyment in simpler forms of entertainment. Neighbors might gather at someone's home for an evening of music, dancing, and storytelling. In some regions, barn dances brought entire communities together, with fiddles, flutes, and drums keeping time while feet stamped on wooden floors. Hunting and fishing were not only practical skills, but also pastimes. A day in the woods after deer or in the river after trout could provide food for the table and a chance to enjoy the quiet beauty of the land. Games like cards, checkers, and ninepins, an early form of bowling, were played when time allowed. Taverns were important social hubs, especially in larger towns. Men gathered to drink ale, exchange news, and discuss politics, where the labor was balanced with food, laughter, and fellowship, offering music, feasts, and games for all ages. If you imagine it now, you might see a summer evening in a small colonial village. The fields are quiet after a day's work, and lanterns glow in a barn where neighbors have gathered. Laughter mingles with the sound of a fiddle. Children chase each other in the warm air outside, replaced by the simple joy of being together. Leisure in the early colonies was rare, but when the work was done, or at least set aside for a while, people found ways to rest, enjoy themselves, and strengthen bonds within the community. Even in a world where survival came first, there was an understanding that the spirit needed its own kind of nourishment. For children, leisure often meant play that mimicked the adult world. They carved small boats to float in streams, made dolls from corn husks or scraps of cloth. In winter, they slid down snowy hills on wooden sleds or frozen pieces of bark. Adults found enjoyment in simpler forms of entertainment. Neighbors might gather at someone's home for an evening of music, dancing, and storytelling. In some regions, barn dances brought entire communities together, with fiddles, flutes, and drums keeping time while feet stamped on wooden floors. Hunting and fishing were not only practical skills, but also pastimes. A day in the woods after deer or in the river after trout could provide food for the table and a chance to enjoy the quiet beauty of the land. Games like cards, checkers, and ninepins, an early form of bowling, were played when time allowed. Taverns were important social hubs, especially in larger towns. Men gathered to drink ale, exchange news, and discuss politics, where the labor was balanced with food, laughter, and fellowship, offering music, feasts, and games for all ages. If you imagine it now, you might see a summer evening in a small colonial village. The fields are quiet after a day's work, and lanterns glow in a barn where neighbors have gathered. Laughter mingles with the sound of a fiddle. Children chase each other in the warm air outside, replaced by the simple joy of being together. The relationship between the colonists and the indigenous peoples of North America was complex, shaped by cooperation, trade, misunderstanding, and, all too often, conflict. These interactions deeply influenced life in the early colonies, leaving marks on both cultures that would last for generations. In the earliest years, trade and mutual aid were often the foundation. Indigenous communities taught settlers how to plant corn in poor soil, how to use fish as fertilizer, how to identify edible plants, and how to navigate the rivers and forests. In return, colonists traded metal tools, cloth, and other goods unfamiliar to their new neighbors. Friendships were sometimes formed, especially in small settlements where daily contact was common. A hunter might share venison with a colonial family, or a settler might help repair a canoe in exchange for guidance through the woods. Language barriers were bridged with gestures, shared work, and the slow exchange of words. But as the colonies grew, tensions increased. Land was the most common cause of disputes. Settlers fenced off fields and claimed ownership in ways that clashed with indigenous views of shared use and stewardship of the land. Hunting grounds were disrupted, and resources became scarcer as more colonists arrived. Some conflicts erupted into violence. Wars between certain colonial governments and indigenous nations could devastate communities on both sides. In these times, fear replaced trust, and old friendships were sometimes swept away by the tide of mistrust. Still, there were always individuals who sought peace, traders, missionaries, and leaders who tried to find common ground. In places, treaties were signed, though not all were honored in the years that followed. If you imagine it now, you might see a quiet meeting on the edge of a clearing. A small group of settlers sits with members of a local tribe, the fire between them casting a warm light on both faces. Words are spoken slowly, translated carefully, each side searching for understanding. In the background, the forest stands silent, holding the memory of both friendship and loss. Religion in the early colonies was not merely a matter of personal belief. It was woven into the very structure of community life, seeking a place where they could worship freely without fear of persecution. In New England, Puritan congregations shaped the rhythm of life. Sunday was the most important day of the week, and the Sabbath was observed with deep seriousness. Church services could last for hours. In the Middle Colonies, a greater diversity of faiths flourished. Quakers, Mennonites, Lutherans, Anglicans, and others lived side by side, each with their own meeting houses and traditions. This mixture created a more tolerant environment than in some other regions, though tensions still arose at times. The southern colonies were home to the Anglican Church, but the rural nature of life there meant that formal services were often held less frequently. Traveling ministers would visit plantations and villages, offering baptisms, weddings, and sermons under the open sky or in simple wooden chapels. Religion touched not only worship but also laws and customs. In Puritan towns, work and play were regulated according to religious rules. In Quaker communities, peace and equality were guiding principles, influencing how neighbors treated one another. For many, faith was also a source of comfort in a world that could be harsh and uncertain. The loss of a crop, the sickness of a child, or the long months of winter could test the spirit, and prayer was often the place where strength was renewed. If you picture it now, you might see a small meeting house on a snowy morning. Inside, candles flicker as neighbors gather, stamping snow from their boots. The air is still, save for the murmur of a hymn rising gently in unison. Outside, the bare trees sway in the wind. But within these walls, there is warmth, not only from the fire, but from the shared hope and belief that carried these settlers across the ocean and into a new life. Education in the early colonies varied greatly depending on where one lived, the values of the community, and the resources available. In some places, it was seen as essential that every child learn to read, primarily so they could read the Bible. In others, practical skills for survival took priority over formal schooling. In New England, Puritan leaders placed a strong emphasis on literacy. They believed every believer should be able to read Scripture for themselves. As early as the mid-1600s, towns with more than 50 families were required by law to hire a schoolmaster. Lessons were simple but strict. Reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious instruction formed the core. The Bible and the New England Primer were the most common textbooks. In the Middle Colonies, education was more diverse, reflecting the varied backgrounds of the settlers. Schools might be run by churches, private tutors, or small community efforts. Instruction was sometimes given in different languages, Dutch, German, or Swedish, depending on the community. Wealthy families often hired private tutors or sent their sons to England for higher education. Many children learned at home, with mothers or older siblings teaching basic reading, while farm and household skills filled much of the day. For girls in most colonies, formal education was limited. Still, there were always exceptions. Daughters of wealthy families or progressive parents sometimes received more advanced instruction. Learning was not confined to classrooms. Storytelling was another form of education, preserving history, values, and moral lessons. If you imagine it now, you might see a one-room schoolhouse on a crisp autumn morning. A small fire burns in the hearth, warming children gathered at rough wooden desks. The teacher, perhaps a stern but kind figure, moves from desk to desk, guiding a shaky hand as it forms letters on a slate. Outside, the wind scatters leaves across the yard. But inside, the steady rhythm of learning shapes the next generation.